Hi class, welcome to chapter 34. This is the first lecture in our last unit, and this lecture is all about biospheres on this planet. And in fact, in this unit, let me just talk about this unit a little bit, because if you think about what we've done in each of the first four units, we started very, very small. We started with molecules and atoms that make up molecules, and then macromolecules that molecules make up, and so on. And we kept getting bigger and bigger as we go through these as we went through those first four units. And now we're in the last unit, and we're zooming way out, and we're going to look at ecosystems and what we call biomes. So now we're looking at how organisms interact with one another, and how those interactions are defined by their environment, and how they in turn define their environment. So before we do this, we need to think about how life is interconnected. So if you think about how living things are connected to other living things, and also how they're connected to non-living things. Think about if you struggle to define some of these for animals, think about yourself, right? You're a living organism. How do you interact with other living organisms, and how do you interact with non-living components of the environment? So take a minute, think about this, and then I'll discuss. So if we're thinking about ourselves, of course, some of our interactions are quite straightforward, right? We interact with our friends, we interact with our teacher, hopefully, we interact with fellow students, we interact with our family. We have lots and lots of interactions with other people. But other than people, what kind of interactions do you have? Well, you probably eat things that were once alive, right? You eat plants, you eat animals. That is a relationship to a formerly living thing. You're also host to lots and lots of organisms. In fact, by cell count, you have more bacteria than human cells on you. So you're kind of like, if you were to count all the living things that you're actually more other things than you are yourself. So you're home to lots and lots of bacteria. You're home to some other parasites. There's these really creepy, if you ever want to gross yourself out, just type into Google what lives in your eyelashes, and you'll see these nasty little alien-looking creatures that live in the hair follicles of your eyebrows and your eyelids, or your eyelashes rather. So you're kind of a living, walking ecosystem yourself. So you have lots and lots of interactions with other living things without even realizing it. Now, if we were to extend that to non-living things, my goodness, we could talk for the next hour on this, right? You're breathing chemicals in and out. You're breathing in oxygen, you're breathing out carbon dioxide, you're drinking water, you're excreting water when you talk through water vapor, through urination, through sweating. And then let's talk about, and not just chemicals, let's think about the built environment. You're interacting with the furniture in your home, the environment in which you live, and so on. So you have all of these interactions that are happening every minute of every day, and you don't even think about them because you're existing within your own little ecosystem. Animals do this too, right? Animals exist within ecosystems outside of human interaction. Of course, that's getting less and less common, but this is the idea that we want to study in this chapter, is how do living things and non-living things interact, whoops, did I skip ahead, within an ecosystem. So we call these living things biotic factor. Bio, of course, means life. So the living components of an environment, as opposed to the abiotic, in other words, the non-living components of an environment. So we want to see how these two things interact within a system, and that's called ecology. So we're going to study the interactions of both biotic and abiotic environments. Of course, the area within that these abiotic and biotic components interact within is called a habitat. So you know how much we love to organize in biology, right? This is one of the first, this is kind of the upper part of one of those early slides that we had in the beginning of the course. We also touched on it in Unit 4, where we started at the level of an atom. Atoms combine to make molecules. Molecules turn into macromolecules, and so on, until we got to the unit of the cell. Remember, the cell is the smallest unit of life, and cells come together eventually to make an individual, right? So an individual is a single organism. Remember last unit, Unit 4, all we did, I shouldn't say all we did, but we really focused on populations. Population is a group of individuals that interbreed with one another that are living in a defined geographic area. Whereas if we kind of put together different populations of animals, for example, here, how many different populations do we see within this community? Well, I see at least four, right? We see rabbits, we see a deer, we see grass of some sort, probably lots of different kinds of grasses, and of course we see trees. So, and again, probably lots of different kinds of trees as well. So a community is all of these different populations, all the different trees that are here, all the different vegetation, animals. Of course, there's lots and lots of bacteria and parasites and all kinds of wonderful things on these rabbits and the deer and so on. These all come together to form a community. So community are all the biotic factors that are within a particular habitat. Now, if we combine those living things, the biotic component, with non-living things, the abiotic components, we now consider this an ecosystem. And of course, all of these ecosystems come together to form our biosphere, which we of course call Earth. So now let's think about how this changes, right? We have processes. At each stage of this organization, we can think about the processes that occur at each level. For example, what happens for an individual? Well, an individual's kind of biological drive is to survive and reproduce. And this is the level at which natural selection occurs, right? This rabbit can survive and reproduce or die and not pass on its genes based on its fitness to the environment. Now, it's only at the level of population can we actually see evolution occur, because remember that evolution can only occur within a population. Evolution can't occur in an individual. We can only start to see the changes in allele frequencies at the unit of, at the level of population. How these populations interact with one another is what we call it interspecies interactions, or interactions among species. For example, these rabbits of course eat the grass, so do the deer. So we could consider, for example, that the deer and the rabbits are competing for the same food source, for example. So this interaction between the deer and the rabbits is a type of interspecies interaction that would happen within a community. So how the energy flows from the sun to the grass to the rabbit to the thing that eats the rabbit, whatever that might be, a wolf, a coyote, and so on, is at the level of the ecosystem. So at the level of the ecosystem, we're going to see how energy flows. Again, for example, from the sun to grass to rabbit to coyote and so on, right? So we can actually trace the flow of energy and of course matter as well through an ecosystem. So now let's look at these one last time. Let's look at these different levels of organizations and how they interact. So let me see if I can, looks like this is just a little, there we go. So how, at the level of the individual, the interactions are, of course, within the cells within the body. How does, for example, the image that's transposed onto the retina of the rabbit, how does it make its way to the brain? How does the rabbit's digestive system work? How does the rabbit maintain homeostasis? Whereas within a population, we're going to look at and be very careful here. Look at this term here, intra, right? Intra. Let me get my pen. Intra means within. So within a species, how do these species interact with one another? Of course, they mate, they compete for mates, they compete for resources, they compete for nesting sites, and so on. So how do all the deer that are in Florida Canyon, for example, right? That's one of the canyons at Balboa Park. How do they interact with one another to survive? Now, on the other hand, within a community, we're going to have inter-specific interactions, right? So inter means between. So what kind of interactions do we have between different species? And again, this ties into what I said in the previous slide, where the grass is eaten by the rabbit is eaten by the coyote, for example. The deer and the rabbit compete for the same resources because they both eat grass and, grass-like things and so on. So how do these different populations within the community interact with one another? And then finally, of course, we can talk about within an ecosystem, how do the biotic and abiotic factors interact with one another. For example, how much water is there, right? There's not a lot of water in Florida Canyon, and it usually comes within 3 to 4 months out of the year. That's changing rapidly, right? Now Florida Canyon reliably gets rainfall about 5 or 6 months out of the year, and that's drastically changing the habitat and the ecosystem of Florida Canyon and all the canyons in San Diego County. The fact that our rainfall is stretching out over more how should I say this, more stretching out for over longer periods of the year, right? My understanding is that we used to really only reliably get rain here from about November to maybe February, and now it's happening as early as October. And of course, we just had rain. Goodness, we had a good rainfall. What, like 2 weeks ago, I think, maybe. So it's lasting into April, possibly even the beginning of May. So the rainfall now is spreading out over longer periods of time. So what effect does that have on the grass that grows in Florida Canyon? And therefore, what does the grass have to do with the rabbits? Does that mean that we're going to have more rabbits or less rabbits, and so on? Whew, that's a lot of interactions. Okay, so of course this statement makes a lot of sense to everyone on a basic level, right? Not all organisms live in all places. There's lots of places on the planet where it's very inhospitable and very few organisms can live there. So just take a minute, think if you can connect each of these things with where they might live. So hopefully we can rule out the first two pretty easily, right? A freshwater pond in Florida is going to be answer C. We can see a fish preying on what look like mosquito larvae, possibly. That's what mosquito. You guys don't know what mosquitoes are. You spoiled little. You guys didn't say you have no idea what mosquitoes are like. Move to the Midwest and you'll know what mosquitoes are. Florida, freshwater pond in Florida. Of course, human skin. This is a scanning electron micrograph of human skin. You can see all the bacteria that exist on that epidermis there. And our last two, we know that the South Pacific, of course, is going to be green and beautiful and lush and next to the ocean. And Western Alaska is going to be answer A. We see the what is this called? I forget, the lichen kind of grass. It's not even grass. It's a type of soil that grows above the permafrost. It's called lichen, and deer eat it. All right, so abiotic, in other words, non-living, right, factors influence the distribution, right? Why can the fish here live in a freshwater pond? Well, because there's water. Why? Because there's lots of rainfall in Florida. How does the amount of sunlight that is in Western Alaska influence the type of vegetation that can grow there, and so on? So there's 5 abiotic factors that can influence the range of organisms that can live there. So the amount of sunlight, the temperature, the predominant temperatures in that region, and how much they change. The water, the amount of water, and how long throughout the year it's available. The kind of nutrients that are available in that particular area and their abundance. And then, of course, there's other factors like wind and fire. We're starting to become more and more accustomed, and unfortunately, we're not really, I shouldn't say we're accustomed, like we as people are getting more accustomed to seasonal fires in California, but this is not typical. California is not designed to handle the frequency and severity of the fires that it has had recently. So when we talk about abiotic and biotic factors, the term limiting factor refers to any factor that limits the ability of organisms to live in that habitat. So an example here would be this is a savanna in Africa, and at most times of the year water is in very, very short supply. So the ability of animals to get to water and survive without water for long periods of time will be a limiting factor for that particular ecosystem. So here's a question for you that can challenge you a little bit. If we have a tropical rainforest, which of the following would be considered an abiotic limiting factor? Well, I hope you recognize that we can cross off A right away because carnivores are alive. And remember, we're asking for abiotic limiting factors. Now, this one will probably surprise you. Believe it or not, the limiting factor in a tropical rainforest ecosystem is actually light. Because the canopy, in other words, the upper kind of the highest part of this forest, the canopy is so dense and so lush that actually very little light gets through to the rest of the forest. And this is kind of like the redwood forest in Northern California. If you've ever had the a chance to get up there, walking through these really dense forested areas, it can be quite dark and quite cool in these forests because most of the sun is kept out by that upper level of leaves that the very tallest trees put out. So light would be an abiotic limiting factor. So when we're talking about a specific location, how can we determine what species can be found there? Well, first we already talked about the abiotic conditions that are there. There were 5 of them that we mentioned. Let me see if I can remember them. Predominant temperature, amount of rainfall, and its like duration, like how spread out it is throughout the year. Oh my goodness. What we got? It's been a long day. Let's go back. What are the 5 of them? Amount of sunlight, and nutrients, and other terrestrial factors, wind and fire. I'm trying to think of another, like, other than wind and fire. I don't feel like earthquakes happen enough to be considered an abiotic factor. What would be another terrestrial factor? Ooh, that's a tough one. Maybe geothermal activity. Like I'm thinking about like in Hawaii, there are many parts of the Iceland would be a great example of this. Iceland is, even though it's really far north, it's quite warm because it's basically a big geothermal pond, right? There's so many geothermal springs in Iceland that the temperature is quite warm throughout the year. Warmer than you would think anyway. So what else, right? The ability to migrate to a location. So the ability of living things to get in or out of that particular area. And then of course, limiting factors and limiting resources. Another concept, there are lots of check-in questions in this one. I like it. Bacteria, fungus, and pine trees. Well, we know it's not climate, right? Because climate is essentially solar axis rainfall. And we know that bacteria, fungi, and pine trees are all alive, so it can't be abiotic. And bacteria are in the domain Prokarya, right? Fungi and pine tree are in Eukarya, so we know that they're not a kingdom, so they have to be biotic components. Which of the following influences the type of organisms occurring? Temperatures, geographic location. D, for sure. All of these do, right? The temperature is going to influence what kind of animals are found in a particular geographic location. The geographic location is going to determine the ability of animals to migrate in and out, of course. And of course, the geographic location, depending on like how far away it is from an ocean or from the equator, will determine its climate. And the rainfall and precipitation pattern will influence the water availability, which will of course have a huge effect on the type of animals that can survive in that particular region. All right. So this is basically what we were talking about in the previous slide. So we have these really kind of broad scale, right here in the title, broad scale abiotic factors that will influence what kind of living organisms can live in these particular biomes. So we have, I think there's like 9. I think we don't really do this one, but there's 9 different what we call biomes, and they're major ecological or major ecosystems that occupy very broad geographic regions. And you can see their distribution here on a map. Remember that our planet has an equator, right? It cuts the planet in half. And then we have 2 tropics that are found at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. The Tropic of Cancer is at 30 degrees north, and the Tropic of Capricorn, of course, is at 30 degrees south. As we get to polar north and polar south, we get further and further from the equator. We know that climate patterns, and of course, this is such a hot topic now, is determined by the heating pattern of Earth's surface. And we know, of course, just generally speaking, the closer we are to the equator, the warmer and more consistently warm that temperature is going to be. Don't forget that you know what this word means now, right? Mean also mean, the mean is another word for average. So the annual average temperature in a particular region. All right. So how do we determine how much, how do we determine this average temperature? How can we predict this? And why is it warmer at the equator than it is at the poles? Well, because we want to look at the amount of radiant energy that's coming from the sun and how our planet moves in space. Remember that our planet kind of goes, tilts back and forth as it rotates around the sun. And so when the sun is striking at whatever angle our Earth is tilted at, wherever that sun is striking the most directly is going to receive the most radiant energy from the sun. As that angle gets sharper, notice that here we have essentially a right angle. Here we have a very low angle of reflection, and this one, the light has to travel slightly further, but we also have an angle of what would this be called? I don't want to say refraction. That's not maybe it is refraction. Angle of refraction, or maybe angle of reflection. I'm thinking, I have microscopy in my head right now. We're talking about microscopy and microbiology, and I know that's not the right word, but you kind of understand this at a very basic level, right? If you have a hot, like if you have the burner on your stove, right? If you hold your hand directly over, like not on top of it, of course, but directly over it, at flat, you're going to catch a lot of the heat coming from that burner. But if you angle your hand, a lot of that heat will dissipate off of it, and it just depends on the angle at which you hold your hand over that heat source. It's not that much different with our planet and the sun. So when we're talking about global patterns in terms of how our seasons change and so on, looking at it from a northern hemisphere, our patterns are determined by how our equator basically tilts forward and back as we go, right? One revolution around the sun is a year, and we have 4 major kind of events throughout the year. We have the March equinox. I feel like it's in April. I feel like it's usually in April, and I feel like our June solstice is usually in July. This doesn't sound. It of course varies depending on the year, because it's not dependent on a calendar year. It's dependent on particular solar patterns when we're in terms of how much solar access we get. Right, we have a December solstice. In fact, that's what our Yule is. Right, that's basically lines up with Christmas, and of course we have our fall equinox, or our autumnal equinox, in September. So when we're talking about these biomes, these 9-ish major ecosystems, we're going to talk about, when we talk about the biomes, they have a dominant vegetation type. And of course, that vegetation type is dependent on the scale, or on the climate itself. So how much water does it get? How much water throughout the year does it get? And how much solar access does it get? So I'm not going to go through all of these. That each of these slides kind of characterize the 9 different biomes that we have, but I do want to point out a couple things. You always want to look at this right here. This is going to show you where the temperature range is and how much precipitation it gets. And I also like to point out the distribution pattern that you see on the different continents. So as you go through each of these slides, again, they're pretty self-explanatory. They're straightforward enough that I don't have to talk through them. Make note of each of these, and these will definitely be on the test. And there's some beautiful videos that I put here, and you can watch each of them as you like. Which one are we? Well, I would say that we're predominantly chaparral. So we have kind of a Mediterranean climate, but our biome is influenced by that Mediterranean climate. And we have cool, rainy winters. We have hot, dry summers, right? We don't have a very high temperature range, right? We don't have super hot days or super cold days. We don't even have, well, at least near the coast, we don't really even have a frost, right? There's no frost patterns here. We have very low precipitation, and of course, we do have the occasional fire. So this is called chaparral. If we were in person, we would actually walk to Florida Canyon and do a tour of the chaparral there. Okay, so which of the following terrestrial biomes listed below is located furthest from the equator? Super close, sometimes close, always far. Definitely coniferous forest. I was right on the border between a broadleaf forest and a coniferous forest when I lived in Wisconsin. I was kind of in what they call a tension zone. If you think about Wisconsin, that's Wisconsin. This is Lake Michigan. This is Lake Michigan here. One of the Great Lakes. This is Lake Superior up here. Two huge lakes. Here's Canada. And the upper part of Wisconsin is a conifer forest, and the lower part is a deciduous forest. So Wisconsin is basically a forest. There's a very small part down here that is grassland. Looks a lot like Illinois. It's very boring. But Wisconsin is really beautiful. It's mostly a forest. The upper part is dominated by conifer forest, and the lower part is deciduous forest. I should be an artist. That's just absolutely gorgeous. Okay. I think this is the last slide, and I just want to mention it because, well, one, I want to give a quick shout out. If you enjoy biology and you enjoy the ocean, you like thinking about biological questions, I want to give a quick pitch to our marine biology course that we have here at City. Stop by. I know the two professors that teach it. They're both wonderful, and they go into a lot of detail about the biology of marine ecosystems. And it's something that we don't think about, right? We can talk about, for example, all of the different temperate regions that there are based on the where they are in terms of the equator and so on. But people don't realize that our oceans have ecosystems too. So they're generally dominated, or they're determined by two factors: how deep the water is and how close the water is to land, and therefore how influenced they are by tidal patterns, right? So you can imagine, right, you've seen those like kind of Scientific American episodes where they have the strangest deep sea creatures that are just, you would swear they're not alive. They're just so creepy looking, right? Those are connected to these very, very deep ecosystems that are only found in very, very deep parts of the ocean. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard this or not, but we know we've mapped more square miles of the moon than we have of our own oceans. I don't want to say every day, but probably, let's just say at least a dozen times a year, we discover a new species that we never realized existed in the oceans. And they're just amazing. There's so much diversity in the oceans, and there's so much that we still have to learn about them. And I just wanted to touch on it briefly because they do exist. And I don't want to pretend that the oceans don't have their own diversity and their own cool story. We just don't have time for it in this semester, and especially this semester, because we're so short on time. So I think that does it for this lecture 34. Only 2 more lectures to go. I know you're really sad about this. And let me get out of here. Pause the video.